We're really thrilled to have you all here at ODI tonight. It's a really exciting occasion for me because I worked very closely with Raj and he continues to do amazing things, and we're going to get into that in a couple of minutes. It's also exciting because today we have launched our annual review, and you might see a copy of it outside, but more importantly, you should go online because we have done our first ever digital first version, and it's far more interesting on the web with cool videos and graphics and exciting stories about basically how we think about how you translate big ideas into impact on the ground for people who need it most. So please go and have a look. We also have a large audience with us tonight that is not in this room, but is online through a number of means. They're going to be reaching out to us. I have this iPad here, which is going to give me some questions throughout. So if you're watching online, welcome. Please do send in your questions. We're also using hashtag tonight, Global Dev, hashtag Global Dev, should be up there. And we have Raj's Twitter handle up there too. So you can tweet at him if he says something funny or something not funny. Let me introduce Raj. I have known Raj for a number of years now, and he assumed office as the Rockefeller Foundation's new president on the 1st of March of this year, leading what is one of the oldest and most influential philanthropic institutions, not only in the US, but in the world. And I'll let Raj talk a little bit more about Rockefeller, what he hopes to do there, and some of the things that he's accomplished. But he's had some other interesting jobs too. President Obama appointed Raj to be the administrator for USAID at the end of 2009 and confirmed by the Senate just in time for the Haiti earthquake. How many days in office before that earthquake started?
About 10.
About 10 days. And we'll come back to that, but it was, I think, a phenomenal trial by fire in what is already one of the most challenging and important jobs there is out there. Raj not only served in that role, but because of, I think, that the trust and importance that the president had in him and the importance that the president placed on development as part of his tenure, Raj sat in the National Security Council, participated in debates on things great and small throughout the time that he served there for over 5 years, and also had a profound impact on the president's agenda. I think some of the most important things that President Obama talked about and that he said that he was proudest of were things that often came out of the work that Raj was doing on issues like food security, science, technology, and innovation, and powering Africa, which continues to be something that Raj is deeply involved in. When Raj left USAID, an independent auditor called Results for America rated USAID the largest, the top large US government agency that actually takes evidence and turns it into policy. Which is, of course, something that we work on every day and we think should be the mainstream, but unfortunately it often isn't in government, and that was a really big achievement. President Obama once remarked to a crowd that Raj's career made the president wonder whether he had achieved enough in his life. But President Obama also had a saying, which was, "Go big or go home." And if that translates well to this audience, it means, you know, if you're not in a position like this to take on the biggest challenges facing us, then step aside and let someone else try it. And in my experience, there are some people who dream big. There are some people who get things done. And Raj is really a rare combination of those things. But before you think I'm being too kind to Raj, let me say that sometimes going big often meant falling hard. In fact, you know, some of my most powerful memories of working closely with Raj were decisions to take some big risks. And taking big risks in jobs like that means having some really hard often unpleasant conversations with even bigger people. And I remember I have like this kind of montage sequence in my head of sitting in meetings with Raj, with generals and ministers, maybe more than one national security advisor, lecturing us about maybe getting too big for our britches. But it was really a great pleasure to see what it means to not only have somebody enter a position of responsibility, but to really kind of take it to the max and really see how far you can push things. Because ultimately, what USAID was there for, what Rockefeller is there for, what we're there for is to make a big difference in the lives of people who really need that support. So, Raj, I'm really excited that you're here, and we're going to get to engage in a little bit of a conversation, and then we're going to open it up to the good people here and those online to engage with us. So let me start with a big question for you. At the end of 2015, in the middle of 2015, it seemed as though the world were coming together, had accomplished something kind of extraordinary. You had this new sustainable development goals. You had the Paris Agreement. It seems like we have come a long way since that moment in not entirely positive ways. And when you look at the trajectory from 1990 to 2015 and the reductions in extreme poverty and all of the accomplishments that were made, I think that we were betting on continuing that trend. And now I think a lot of people are wondering, are we, was that an illusion? Are we going to continue the forward progress? What do you think?
Well, ultimately, I think it's up to us. But before I answer that, I just want to say thank you for having me here. Alex, you're a great choice for the Overseas Development Institute. It's an institute that I and you have followed and respected for a very, very long time. And so congratulations on your new post here, and best wishes. And Alex can tell all of those stories about the National Security Council because we were very much a team working together to try to advance and really live up to the President's goal and our Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton's goal of elevating development in the context of how we conducted foreign policy. And that did mean getting into the thick of things. So thank you. Look, I think we have a tendency to take for granted what was accomplished in 2015. The Sustainable Development Goals, the Paris Climate Accords, were the result of many, many years of demonstrating and building consensus across 190 plus countries that you could both reduce the rate of temperature increase around the world and end extreme poverty so that people don't live in large numbers on $1 or $2 of income a day. And I know everyone in this room has a lot of expertise on these topics already, but I find it important for myself and for others to remind all of us that, folks and families that live in those circumstances, still nearly 1 billion people around the world, are the most climate vulnerable. Their kids, most often girls, are the most vulnerable to all kinds of horrendous actions. The likelihood that their children will not survive to age 5, and if they do, will grow up stunted, is extraordinarily high even today. And the most basic, low-cost set of solutions, from improved nutrition to access to food to basic health services, and a simple but consistent education, can transform the lives of those individuals and their families and their communities in an extraordinarily powerful way. And I think sometimes we're too quick to talk about the goals and the big UN agreements. Those agreements were ultimately saying to the world that we see the world's two biggest common challenges that are not security challenges as climate and poverty. And we believe we're going to come together across public and private sector partners to do something about it at scale. So that was a huge accomplishment, and I think many of us just took for granted that now that that was done, we would all go about implementation to achieve those goals in a really results-oriented way. And no, I don't believe that's just going to happen. I think what we've seen I taught for a while at Georgetown University, and I had a slide I'd put up with two Economist covers. One was the Brexit vote, the other was the Trump election. And I think both of those are big, powerful statements that so many people feel left out of the progress that is happening on a global basis, that our progressive global community simply can't go out and say, okay, we're going to tackle these big goals together because that's important for humanity, which it is, without bringing more people along.
So let's talk about the implications of those two covers and a few other things that have happened, the migration crisis in Europe. There is a sense, I think, that some of the wind in the sails in 2015, because of this global political movement that has changed things, has also caused more questioning about aid and whether that's where tax dollars should be going. Obviously, in the United States, there's a proposal for massive cuts to the aid budget. There's been a lot of political pressure through the turbulent year here since Brexit around aid spending levels. Europe is facing some of the same challenges. So it's not just the money, although the money is quite important. We also see sort of a softening maybe of political support for this mission.
Yeah, I think this is just a mission that's easy to manipulate politically, to be honest. So, in Europe, you see the Nordic countries that have been the leaders in terms of the percent of GDP that they spend committed on these goals have a pretty steep decline if you actually look at the redirecting of resources to taking care of domestic refugee flows. That experts in the room will know more, but I've heard it's a 20, 25, 30% decline in real assistance to results-oriented development efforts around the world in poor countries external to Sweden or Norway or Denmark. The UK has, we're all watching to see what the UK does. We stood and leveraged the example of the UK as you marched up to 0.7% of GDP and did it with a political sophistication and real political leadership that I think set a tone for the global community. And in the US, it's a disaster. There's just no other way to describe it. What you hear about is a 30% proposed cut in the Trump budget obscures the fact that 30% includes the entire operations of the United States State Department. And given that we're not going to shut down a third of our embassies around the world, in practice, the cuts to aid and assistance are 50, 60, 70% in some areas. And so at a time when there are 4 active food security crises and teetering on famines, the United States budget proposes a steep stepping away from our traditional 6 or 7 decade long role as the world's humanitarian leader on food assistance in particular and hunger. In health, similarly, we're cutting back severely programs on voluntary family planning, on providing maternal and child health support. To your point, the policy changes, which don't get as much attention, will effectively take American leadership on women's health and health of adolescent girls beyond down to zero. It'll be, will be a negative influence as those things play out, if they play out as proposed, and it goes on and on. The McGovern-Dole school feeding program, which George McGovern and Bob Dole, two iconic American political leaders from opposite sides of the spectrum, came together and passed through the Senate on a unanimous basis, has been, and which feeds millions of young children and provides their school lunch, has been cut to zero. And I visited, before I was even at USAID, I ran a part of the U.S. Department of Agriculture, and Tom Vilsack, our agriculture secretary, and I visited kids in the Kibera slum in Nairobi who came to school to get that cup of porridge for their lunch and the second one to take home to their family. And that cup of porridge cost us something like 12 cents a cup to provide, and the Trump administration wants to end it. So the degree to which American humanitarian leadership is sort of in question right now could not be overestimated. I'd give you one other statistic, that if you took the 15 largest American foundations and used all of their annual giving to fill the gap that the Trump administration has proposed as their cuts, you wouldn't even fill the gap for U.S. aid alone. So this is not the kind of problem philanthropy can step in and solve for, nor should it. These are public sector responsibilities, and either we're going to live in a world where everyone's genuinely on their own, and those who are going to be left to starve in refugee camps or on the streets of major cities around the world, or we have to recreate a politics that allows for the spirit that's been so evident in British leadership on foreign affairs issues over the last 15 years.
So that sounds like a good segue to talking about the role of philanthropy, and maybe specifically Rockefeller. So you've been in office 5 months, 4 months?
Yeah.
I know that you've been thinking about what the role of the foundation could and should be, not only vis-a-vis those things, but in a long-term sense. You want to give us a taste of where you might be going?
Sure. Well, we're sorting it out. I guess I'd start by just introducing two colleagues. One is Olivia Leland, who is here. Olivia, put your hand up. Olivia's starting our London presence for the Rockefeller Foundation and brings an extraordinary track record of leadership in philanthropic efforts, but also in the public sector at places like the Millennium Challenge Account. And I'm excited for all of you to get to know Olivia and vice versa and help each other out as we try to work more actively with the community here. And Josh Murphy, a colleague who works with me day to day at the Rockefeller Foundation as well. You know, the foundation is an extraordinary place. It's 104 years of investing in what John D. Rockefeller called scientific philanthropy. The basic idea was, how can you help the most people in the world? It's not just by offering charity to meet immediate needs, but also thinking about what types of science and innovation could be applied strategically over the long term to really lift up the most people. And it were those insights and Rockefeller employees like Norman Borlaug, who was, I think, our longest standing employee at 44 years of engagement, that led to the innovations that powered the Green Revolution that moved more than 1 billion people off the brink of hunger and starvation in Latin America and South Asia and other parts of the world. Those insights led to the modernization of medical practice, both in the United States and abroad. Back in 1913, they put a bunch of philanthropists together on a train and took them through the American South and concluded that it would be in the interest of our nation at a time when the public sector didn't do these things to eradicate hookworm from the American South, and that led to a long history in global public health, starting in the United States. And we've had a big focus throughout our history on economic issues, creating institutions like the National Bureau of Economic Research and creating the modern national statistical accounting system that led to how America measures its most basic economic output. So I'm honored to get the chance to participate in the next chapter. And we're focused very much on looking at the world and applying science, technology, and innovation in ways that could really transform outcomes for global poverty, but also improve how we make jobs more accessible to the working and middle class in the United States. And those will be our two main areas of focus going forward. They have been in the past, and we'll continue to invest in efforts to address and build resilience in communities where we work in. I can get into that as well. But right now we're in a period of figuring it all out, and we'd love to learn from you and work with you as we sort of create the next chapter of what's been a pretty amazing institution that I'm thrilled to be a part of.
If you had to say what's the next, if you were telling this story in 10 years and recounting who the next Norman Borlaug was or the next innovation that you helped to fund, do you have some guesses on things that you think are going to be transformative in the next decade?
Well, we have some active programs that I think are leading to some insights around that. One is, for example, We all know there are 1.2 billion people around the world that don't have access to power, something you and I worked on pretty intensively in Africa, but also in South Asia and even parts of Latin America. And it turns out, since so many in this room care about inclusive growth and developmental outcomes, that countries that have big discrepancies in power access can experience rapid growth but don't have the same powerful outcome of reducing poverty through their growth. And so we think power access enables much more inclusion along the growth path. In that context, we have a great project called Smart Power India, where we're bringing off-grid, rural, solar energy to communities that otherwise don't have grid access and really don't have power. And it's incredible, as you've seen, to see what that kind of solution can do for these households. A mother who is cooking indoors can now get, use power to improve the way they're conducting almost all the activities of daily living. A small business all of a sudden has power and lower cost power than diesel generation, which can cost 50, 60 cents a kilowatt hour. Now you get power at 12 to 14 cents a kilowatt hour. It just transforms what's possible economically. Kids who otherwise aren't active after dark can now start reading and studying at night, and you see literacy outcomes and other outcomes go up. And we've pioneered this effort with a group of companies that are trying to make a viable commercial product that can, in a low-cost and efficient way, build microgrids and bring power to these rural communities in India, but also in Africa and other parts of the world. So that's just one example of where innovation can bend the curve of what's possible in fighting extreme poverty, and do it in a way that is an appropriate role for philanthropic risk capital. Creating those new solutions that have a chance to end energy poverty around the world.
So talk a little bit more about the risk capital idea, because as you already said, the philanthropic money is not a replacement either for foreign direct investments, certainly not for money coming from aid agencies, domestic resources, but it can actually play a catalytic role. How do you think about how to use your resources in a way that get bigger bang for the buck? And how do you, this is a trickier question, but how do you differentiate what Rockefeller is going to do from others?
Well, so on the first, I'll give you an example. We have a project we call 100 Resilient Cities, which works with cities all around the world. 21 are in the United States. And we have more than 80 resilience officers that report to mayors that have created these resilience strategies. They work on projects related to water management and water access, to public hygiene, to building climate adaptation-oriented infrastructure in cities like New Orleans and Norfolk, Virginia, so they're protected from the next storm surge. The amount of leverage we get from that kind of activity is incredible. We have private businesses that have committed more than $500 million of resources to these cities. In just New Orleans alone, this was because of the BP oil spill and the fund that was created, a lot of what was crafted as a resilience strategy for the city of New Orleans, reclaiming a watershed outside of the city so that you're quite literally rebuilding forest and land off the shore of New Orleans to protect it from the next storms. All of that is now going to be funded by the fund, multi-billion-dollar fund, $7.5 billion fund that was created. So those kinds of public-private partnerships that bring people together, create consensus strategies for solving a problem, include private sector financial commitments, and I think also include big public sector commitments, are kind of how we hope to get leverage to achieve these goals, whether it's ending energy poverty or ending under 5 child deaths around the world, or addressing how to build a sustainable global food system that helps wipe out malnutrition and protein calorie malnutrition in particular. So that's part of it. On the second part of the question of how do we differentiate from others, I don't know that we necessarily need to or want to. I mean, we want to be a great partner with others. In fact, Olivia's project is called the Collaborative for Scaling Social Impact. and is a partnership that she's building across, that we're working to build across a range of philanthropic partners to do philanthropy collaboratively. Because I think we learned this together, right, at AID and in other settings. When you get folks working together against a common set of problems, like that's where you get the real energy. During the 2012 Camp David G8, for example, we got African presidents together with the CEOs of major food and agricultural businesses and led to kind of billions of dollars of new commitments to build out agribusinesses in poorer countries, and in doing so, reach and measure and count the impact on small-scale farmers in those projects. That's helped lift so many people out of poverty by bringing people together and collaborating, as opposed to sort of insisting on being super differentiated. So we'll see. But on the second part, that might have been a non-conventional answer. But I'm less interested in being differentiated and more interested in as if we together can actually solve and achieve the stated Sustainable Development Goals. And if we play a modest part on a handful of those, that's an outcome we can all take pride in.
That's a great message. Let's go a little bit more on urbanization. I saw one of those sort of freak you out statistics the other day that the world by 2050 will have gone from about 50% to 2/3 urbanized, and that in that time frame, 2.5 billion more people will be living in cities. And then to make it even more intense, you look at how many of those are coastal cities and sea level rise questions. I mean, that seems like a massive looming challenge that obviously the work that you're talking about speaks to, but it's going to take a lot. And I imagine the path that we're on right now is not going to get us there. So we got to, as you say, bend the curve. What do you think is going to make that happen, particularly in the more challenging places, whether it's Lagos or other parts of the world?
Well, so part of what's going to make that happen is political leadership. And what's amazing is to see, certainly we have 100 mayors in our network. Mayor Bloomberg has a project with 40 cities that are the Climate 40. It does seem like at a time when our federal or national political leaders are clearly stepping back from being the innovators and problem solvers on these types of issues, that at least some mayors are willing to say, look, I'm going to try the best I can given a very practical, pragmatic job that I've got, to protect and improve the quality of this city. And so if we can build communities of mayors around the world that are solving these problems, in our 100 Resilient Cities effort, for example, more than half of those cities have prioritized water management, especially the lower income countries with cities that are going from 10 or 12 million to 25, 30 million in the time frame you just identified. These are cities where more than half the population still doesn't have access to proper piped water systems or clean drinking water at an affordable price. So helping cities create resilient infrastructure that actually provides clean drinking water to children, removes waste and manages that effectively, brings new technology to bear on that task, and ideally brings financing from all kinds of partners, from the World Bank to the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank to other institutions that can actually write the big checks to make that happen, should be in our common interest, and is just one example of what these cities platforms can achieve.
There's an interesting thread in several things that you've said about programs like that, which are obviously different a little bit from USAID, which is that a lot of the challenges that you're talking about, whether it's climate change, we haven't talked about, but pandemics, the future of work and jobs, these are not developed country problems. Is it time somehow that we get past these distinctions, because the big challenges seem to kind of confront everybody?
Well, I think so. I think we have officially, right? The Sustainable Development Goals are the first truly global set of goals. And when you look at health disparities in America, for example, especially after what just happened in Charlottesville and the way our president responded, people don't fully appreciate or see the long-term persistent disparities in health that take place in the United States. infant mortality rates in African American urban settings in the 50 largest American cities are more than 4 times what they are in the same suburbs of those cities. And that's crazy, right? It is not consistent with the way the goals are shaped, and a great country that is also a wealthy country that also has a $2 trillion healthcare system ought to be able to solve that problem as part of its path to achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. So one thing I've learned by visiting our Resilient Cities projects is that whether you're in a developed country, so to speak, or a developing country, a lot of these mayors and leaders just want to solve problems. They want to be connected to the tech companies and the infrastructure partners and the financing partners that are able to help them do it. And they really appreciate working with each other to learn from each other to do that. And so I agree. I think we'll have to rethink, what we're talking about when we talk about global development. But I do think it's going to be seeing more commonality than distinction in how we tackle these challenges.
There was an article the other day, I don't know if people saw it, it was actually in the New York Times on the continuing coverage of what happened here in London with the Grenfell Towers fire. And it pointed out, looking at statistical data, that within the same borough of London, different parts of that borough had a 20-year discrepancy in life expectancy within one borough. So that's powerful. You were in Ethiopia recently, as you were starting to say. I want to hear something about that trip, because it is in some ways about the future of the work and the changes in the global economy, but it's also a little bit of a reality check of the world that we're really living in when you look at the world's largest economy, China, and the impact that that's now having. So tell us a little bit of what you saw.
Well, just for a little context, we've had at the Rockefeller Foundation a really innovative program called Digital Jobs Africa. And we've helped more than 100,000 people, but in Kenya alone, more than 40,000 people get trained to access digital jobs, whether they are in the community there or ultimately tied to companies that are in the United States or around the world. And we see this explosion of interest, of course, amongst those firms for trained talent that can do computer science and computer programming, these activities. And we all know there's a ton of capacity and young people all over the planet that want to be connected to that fast-moving engine of innovation and employment and work. So that seemed like a pretty powerful way to help create jobs in an environment where we know young people who are unemployed or underemployed lead to a lot of challenging consequences for those societies and those communities. So we saw those projects in Kenya, and I thought they were great projects, but they also felt like maybe relatively modest in scale, in the sense that you're reaching tens of thousands of people and you're doing the training. And then we went to Ethiopia and we visited a number of large-scale manufacturing facilities. And what the Ethiopian government has done as part of its Made in Ethiopia or Made in Africa project is basically gone to Chinese provinces and said, look, we'll build for you a manufacturing hub. It'll be close and tied to international trade and transport. We have AGOA, the American Growth and Opportunity Act, so manufactured goods here can go to the Chinese market or the US market or the Chinese market for the US market without additional tariff. And let's together create 10 million new jobs, taking advantage of the price differential of labor between Ethiopia and China. So we're walking through these textile facilities, looking at, what I'd consider excellent clothing. My standards are different than probably some of you in London, but and we asked the manager there, and I said, well, what is the actual labor cost differential? Like you're putting hundreds of thousands of jobs now in these industrial hubs in Ethiopia. What are you getting for it? And he said, well, in Ethiopian labor in this context is about 1/5 the cost of Chinese labor. And I guess the point I'd make is when you look at how the Chinese Development Bank and the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank and the One Belt, One Road policy out of China has created a massive amount of low-cost capital for African development, but also for other Asian communities. And you tie that to these types of examples where the scale of thinking around job creation in the context of your future of work comment is just so large that that feels like an at-scale effort. And you can understand why. If you're the Prime Minister of Ethiopia, you would think that that is a viable and important part of your development strategy, because you got the bulk of your population in their 20s, and they need work, and they're going to need work for a long time, and that labor cost differential is going to exist for some time. So, I think the lesson for us is these larger public sector strategies around job creation and the future of work are going to be fairly dominant in how countries grow. And instead of doing kind of specific projects, being a big part of that policy and political dialogue is one path to having that scale impact.
So staying in Africa, but expanding
Yeah.
out a little bit from there, something that you and I have spent a lot of time talking about. There's a lot of fragility concentrated in Africa. There's a lot of the world's remaining or soon to be remaining extreme poverty concentrated in Africa. How do we work on that challenge when you have some countries that are clearly stepping forward and doing the right things and others that seem to be stuck?
Well, you have a lot of expertise on that question, so you are going to have to add to the answer or just flat out answer it. And ODI has done excellent work on bridging the divide between humanitarian action and work in fragile states. I've been here for a couple of days in London speaking to one of my Uber drivers who was from Mogadishu and in Somalia, and I explained how I had the chance to visit there during my tenure in the Obama administration. And the reality is, there were points in time when Somalia, as an example of one fragile state, had a new president, new government, a semblance of security, not just at the airport, but maybe more broadly around the city. And there was an opportunity to act as a global community to really help that country get on its own 2 feet. And I remember the UK in particular leading the donor conferences on Somalia. I think you probably went. And everybody committed resources. And then, to be honest, on the ground, very little happened. Like, there were a lot of great conversations about World Bank trust funds and other kinds of activities, a lot of wonderful planning, but not a lot of action on the ground. And we saw that in Libya after the fall of Gaddafi. We saw that in many parts of Afghanistan, despite a pretty big international effort. We saw that in Haiti after the earthquake. And I think the challenge of an institution like the Overseas Development Institute or the Development Enterprise is going to be much, much, much more focused on those types of settings than it is on stable, reasonably well-governed settings that are growing at 8 or 9% a year anyway. And I would argue that our institutions, designed after World War II at a Bretton Woods conference in Maryland, just are not purpose-built for that goal. And so I don't have a solution, but there's obviously a lot of discussion about what can be done. This, to me, is the critical challenge. If we're going to end extreme poverty, it's going to be in Somalia and northern Nigeria and Yemen and parts of Pakistan, and it's just not going to be in Ghana, because Ghana's not going to have a lot of extreme poverty in a decade. What do you think?
Well, you have been, I'm going to ask you to square a circle, a challenging circle, because you've been a big advocate of making sure that aid and development spending focuses on results and that we measure those results carefully. And I think at the same time, a lot of the contexts that we're talking about are not necessarily always high results environments. Where
Well, no, I disagree. I remember when you highlighted the demographic and health survey out of Afghanistan, right, that showed in an extraordinarily poor country, in a place with an extreme amount of continued violence, we had the fastest reductions in maternal and child mortality anywhere in the world from, 2002 to 2012. And that happened because of a concerted effort to take basic health services from something like 9% access to 65% access, right?
Yeah.
So if you can do that in Afghanistan in that setting, why do we always have to say that, oh, you cannot be results oriented in Somalia or Yemen or something like that? I think we have to figure out how to do our work better and be rigorous about results. And frankly, even more so in fragile settings where corruption's a bigger risk, where you've lived through some extraordinary examples of that.
Not personally, just to clarify for the audience. I have lived through them, but I was not the subject.
You've lived through President Obama saying, "Go do something about it." Right. So, but it's a challenge we can solve. One of my final experiences as USAID administrator was leading the Ebola response in West Africa, and here's a disease that, frankly, believe it or not, it caused a high rate of mortality in a population when infected, but otherwise it was not a particularly scary pandemic. It was not transmitted via air. It was not particularly rapid in its transmission and its mutation rate and all of that. But nevertheless, it led to 30,000 infections and 11,000 deaths because it transpired in 3 countries that were broken countries. And, Guinea, Sierra Leone, and Liberia basically had very weak public health systems to begin with. And then the first thing that happened were health workers who were on the front line of taking care of people sick with Ebola perished themselves in the summer of 2014, so that by the time you got to August or September, it was spreading in an uncontrolled manner. So much so that almost all of the international NGOs and health institutions that would do something about it were not immediately able to mobilize and be present as first responders on the ground in these settings because they were worried about getting infected and putting their staff at undue risk in that context. That's just one example. If we're not prepared to deal with a pandemic threat in a place like Liberia or Sierra Leone, we're certainly not prepared to deal with a famine at scale in Yemen, or which is happening as we speak, and we're certainly not well constructed to deal with the extraordinary violence taking place, coupled with a famine in South Sudan. And we've sat with military leaders who kept coming to people in the development community and said, well, why isn't there a better solution? Why is the solution always, we're going to ask Oxfam and Mercy Corps to go into a place where people are shooting at each other to prevent something from happening? And we love and care about Oxfam and Mercy Corps and want them to be successful, but the time has probably come for a much more aggressive capacity to respond in some of these very tough settings.
So let me ask you 1 or 2 more questions and we'll go to the audience. But on that, we are facing a moment of 4 famines or potential famines. You still have the seemingly never-ending Syria crisis and all of the challenges that is creating. The United States, along with the UK and others, have consistently led the world in humanitarian response, and it ain't getting any easier. Just last week, Mark Green, who is President Trump's appointee for USAID, stepped into your old office. What are your recommendations for him? First, just specifically on how to handle what seems at the moment to be an extraordinary number of crises in a moment when budgets are going down.
Well, I think first I want to say I'm a friend of Mark's and he's a friend of mine. I'm very, very excited that someone who cares about and knows about and is committed to the mission of development and humanitarian leadership is at the helm of USAID in this administration. If we could have designed this, the day after the election, you couldn't do any better than Mark Green. So, it's all of our combined task to help him out. I do hope he stays strong because, unlike the working environment you and I had, I don't think he's entering an NSC principals table with everybody saying, "How can we help you?" And but I'll just say, the first time I actually was in an NSC was the day of the Haiti earthquake, and it was the president, the head of the table, saying, "Okay, we're going to go around the table, and everyone's going to talk about how they help USAID lead a coordinated response and do it with the no excuses mindset." Right? So, you never know. You never know. Mark could be very successful, and I think we have to hope and pray for that. The other advice I'd have for him would be like, go back in there and ask for a new budget, right? He just got appointed. He should go in and say, you do not want to be the president who on your watch let hundreds of thousands of children starve and led to dismantling health programs that have extraordinary bipartisan support. Our Congress has not been known for civility or friendship, and certainly not bipartisan action over the last decade. Its approval rating today, I think, is 9%, and when we were in government, its approval rating was the sky-high, low teens. And in that environment, they passed major legislation to continue the president's AIDS program. On a bipartisan basis, greatly expanded investments in global immunization, announcements we made right here at the Queen Elizabeth II Conference Center with Prime Minister Cameron and your colleagues in the British government. They passed the Global Food Security Act, which is the second largest American piece of legislation on global development since PEPFAR was passed Electrify Africa, all of this on a bipartisan basis. So I think going in and saying, let's rethink what we've been doing, given that there is this immediate crisis, given that we know the cuts in these programs will lead to real and immediate loss of life, and given that the last thing you want to be doing is kind of sending troops or having to deal with sending troops into the places you'd rather not have to deal with in a military context, let's use our aid more aggressively in this context and just rethink the policy we've put forth. I don't know what he's going to do, but that would be my first word of advice.
Yeah, and on the broader opportunity, that description is a good one. It's a lot of fighting rearguard actions to protect where things are. What do you think could be done? And maybe I'll open this up to Priti Patel here, who's the Minister for DFID. What, given the still critical role that the United States and the United Kingdom can play on the big vision for international investment and aid, what should they be looking at in the next couple of years?
Well, I think the reality is we're fighting it from a defensive position, right? It's the stated policy, at least of the U.S. government now, to largely get out of the business of foreign assistance and aid. So I don't know that I'd be hugely ambitious. I would use the moment as one of reform. I'd point out that the most aggressive country that is using its soft power to expand its spheres of influence around the world is China. And the Chinese institutions, like the Chinese Development Bank and the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, are now larger in their global outlays in developing countries than the World Bank Group. And if you're making a bet 20 years out, unless there are some new partnerships with those Chinese institutions, I think the Bretton Woods institutions will be less important without that. So I would frame it in that context and just make the point that we got to rethink how we're doing this work. Make it more about trade and investment, make it more about results in fragile states and national security hotspots. Do the work with philanthropic institutions like the Gates Foundation and the Rockefeller Foundation and the partners in the Giving Pledge community that want to use their private capital to make the world a better place. and give people the opportunity to save lives in places that matter in an efficient way, and thereby make the world safer. I actually think we succeeded at building a bipartisan community and bipartisan political support by getting faith institutions and corporate leaders, conservative members of Congress, and student groups all across the country deeply engaged in the politics of aid and assistance. And I think we need a little bit of revitalizing that thinking, both here in the UK and certainly in the United States.